The HOA poisoned my reservoir just to stop me from fishing. The smell hit me first. Sulfur. Then I saw them. Hundreds of dead trout, floating belly up. This was my sanctuary, the one place I brought my granddaughter to heal after her mom passed. The HOA president just smirked when I confronted her, acting like she'd won. But what she didn't know is that they didn't just kill my fish. They had just poisoned their own lifeline. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below because you're about to see how this entire thing backfires. And if you believe no homeowner should ever be bullied on their own land, hit subscribe so you never miss a story where justice is finally served. The sun wasn't even thinking about climbing over the ridge yet, but the air had that cool, damp promise of a good morning. I stood at the edge of my reservoir, the one I dug and dammed and filled myself 30 years ago. The water was like black glass, perfectly still. My old canvas vest felt familiar, the pockets weighted with the comfortable junk of 1,000 fishing trips. It's funny how a man's hands can get stiff with age, but they'll still know how to tie a fly in the dark. I reached into my bag and pulled out the little pink tackle box. It was plastic, the kind you buy for a kid, with a faded unicorn sticker peeling at the corner. Scrawled across the top in a child's careful handwriting was, "For Gramps, love, Kay." I ran my thumb over her name. Kay hadn't spoken for almost 6 months after my daughter, her mother, passed away. The doctors had all their theories, their quiet rooms and soft questions, but nothing worked. It was here, sitting on the big flat rock we now called Kay's Rock, that she finally started talking again. She'd pointed a shaky finger at a turtle sunning itself on a log and whispered, "He looks sleepy." I almost dropped my rod. This water, this little pocket of peace I'd carved out of the earth, it wasn't just a fishing spot. It was where my family came to heal. It was where I talked to my wife after she was gone. This place was sacred. So, when I saw her marching down the path, clipboard in hand, I felt a knot tighten in my gut. Her name was Annette Granger. She'd just been elected HOA president a few months back, and you'd think they'd handed her a military command. She had that look, a person who'd been ignored their whole life and was now determined to make everyone pay for it. She stopped about 10 feet away, making a show of looking from her clipboard to my reservoir and back again. "Good morning, Mr. Delaney," she said, though the tone was anything but good. "I'm afraid I have to address an issue." I reeled in my lines slowly, not giving her the satisfaction of my full attention. "This is private property, Anne," I said, keeping my voice even. She gave a thin, practiced smile. "Not entirely. Your reservoir is visible from the community nature trail. As such, its use and appearance are now subject to aesthetic review by the board." I just stared at her. Aesthetic review? For a body of water I built before this HOA even existed? Furthermore, she continued, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on her clipboard, "we have no record of this fishing activity being authorized. It constitutes an unauthorized use of a shared visual water resource." The words were so ridiculous, so meaningless, I almost laughed, but I could see she was dead serious. This wasn't about rules, it was about power. It was about her telling me what I could and couldn't do on the land my grandfather had homesteaded. I tried to be reasonable. I explained that the easement she was probably thinking of was for utility access along the far edge of my property, 100 yards from the water. I built this cabin, this reservoir, decades before their manicured little community was even a blueprint. I owned the land, I owned the water rights, and I had the paperwork locked in a fireproof safe to prove it. She just waved a dismissive hand. "The old documents are vague, Mr. Delaney. The new board interprets them to mean that any feature impacting the community's visual harmony falls under our jurisdiction." It was a declaration of war, dressed up in cheap corporate jargon. She told me to expect a formal notice. Then she turned and marched back up the path, leaving the smell of her perfume hanging in the clean morning air like a pollutant. My daughter Lisa begged me to ignore it. "Dad, she's just a bully on a power trip. Don't give her the fight she wants." But this wasn't just any fight. This was about my home. Still, I took Lisa's advice and tried the diplomatic approach. I went to the next HOA meeting. It was held in the clubhouse, a sterile room with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs. Anne sat at the head of the table, flanked by a nervous-looking woman and a stout man in a cheap security vest who eyed me like I was planning to steal the water cooler. When my turn came to speak, I laid out the facts simply and clearly. I spoke about the property lines, the date of construction, the water rights. I even brought up Kay's Rock, explaining why the reservoir was so important to my family. They talked right over me. Anne's cronies smirked. She herself leaned into her microphone and said, "While your personal stories are touching, Mr. Delaney, they don't supersede community bylaws." Someone in the back snickered. They called it my private pond and my little fishing hobby, deliberately choosing words to make me and my life's work sound small and insignificant. I walked out of that room with a cold fire burning in my chest. They hadn't listened to a single word of reason. They didn't want a neighbor. They wanted a subject. 2 mornings later, the sign was there. It was cheap metal, hammered crookedly into the ground right next to the path to the water. In stark black letters, it read, "No fishing, HOA property." The sheer arrogance of it took my breath away, claiming my land as their own. I grabbed the post with both hands, the cold metal biting into my palms, and ripped it out of the ground. The legs bent with a satisfying shriek of protest. I was about to heave it into the woods when the smell hit me. It was sharp, chemical, like sulfur and rotten eggs. My eyes started to water. I dropped the sign and stumbled toward the reservoir's edge. And then I saw them. First one, then another, then a dozen. My trout. The ones I'd stocked and raised for years, floating belly up, their silver sides catching the pale morning light. A thick, oily film shimmered on the surface of the water. The whole reservoir, my sanctuary, the place where my granddaughter found her voice again, was dead. They had poisoned it. For a long moment, I just stood there, the bent metal sign still clutched in one hand. The air was thick with that chemical stench, and the silence was wrong. The birds were gone. The usual hum of insects over the water was gone. All that was left was the sight of those pale bellies reflecting a sky that felt suddenly cold and gray. My knees felt weak. I let the sign fall with a clatter and walked to the edge, my boots sinking into the soft mud. This wasn't just a loss of fish, it was a desecration. Every inch of this place held a memory. I saw my wife, gone 5 years now, laughing as she tried to teach a 4-year-old Lisa how to cast. I saw my granddaughter Kay sitting on her rock, her little shoulders hunched in a world of silence, until a turtle finally broke the spell. They had taken all of that. They had come onto my land in the dark and poured poison into the heart of my family's history. The anger was a hot, solid thing in my chest, but beneath it was a grief so profound it felt like I was being hollowed out. I looked at Kay's Rock, that big flat slab of granite, and it didn't look like a place of healing anymore. It looked like a gravestone. The next day, my hands shaking just slightly, I took photos. Close-ups of the dead fish, the oily sheen on the water, the scorched-looking grass near the bank where something had clearly been dumped. I put the photos in a manila envelope and drove to the HOA clubhouse for their emergency board meeting, a meeting I wasn't invited to, but attended anyway. I walked in and stood at the back of the room. Anne Granger was in the middle of a sentence, but she stopped dead when she saw me. The smug little security captain, Doug Reeves, took a step toward me, puffing out his chest. I ignored him and walked straight to the table, placing the photos in front of Anne. "You wanted to talk about my reservoir," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Let's talk about it." She glanced at the pictures, her expression barely flickering. The nervous treasurer, Cheryl, looked like she was about to be sick. Anne pushed the photos back toward me with the tip of one finger, as if they were contaminated. "This is a desperate tactic, Mr. Delaney," she said, her voice dripping with false pity. "We are all very concerned about the environmental incident on the land adjacent to our community." I stared at her, dumbfounded. Her community, my land? "You did this," I said. The words came out flat and hard. Anne let out a small, derisive scoff. It was a sound of pure contempt. "Frankly," she said, leaning into the microphone so everyone in the room could hear her performance, "the board finds it highly suspicious that this poisoning occurred right after you were issued a notice of violation. Some might even say you did this yourself to make the HOA look bad." The room was silent. I could feel every eye on me. She was painting me as a crazy old man, a vengeful landowner willing to destroy his own property to win an argument. The accusation was so vile, so twisted, that for a second I had no words. I just picked up my photos and walked out. My next stop was the county water board. I found an administrator named Peterson, a man about my age with tired eyes who understood maps and property rights. He listened patiently, looked at my photos, and pulled up my land deeds on his computer. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Delaney, you're 100% in the right," he told me. "That's your land, your water. The HOA's claim is bogus. The problem," he said, leaning forward, "is enforcement. They're alleging you did this. You're alleging they did it. Without a witness or a direct chemical trace back to them, it's your word against theirs. We can issue a letter of inquiry, but we can't force them to do anything without absolute proof." I walked away from the county building with a familiar feeling, the hollow thud of bureaucracy hitting a brick wall. There would be no help coming. The system wasn't built to stop people like Anne Granger. It was built for paperwork and plausible deniability. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my old armchair, the lights off, just staring out the window at the black, dead water. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of something else. A question kept turning over and over in my mind. Why? It was overkill. It was stupidly risky. Poisoning a body of water was a serious crime. Why would they take that chance just to stop an old man from fishing? It didn't make sense. And then I remembered something. 2 nights ago, I'd woken up around 3 a.m. and saw the sweep of headlights down by the service road that borders my property. I'd assumed it was a utility truck, maybe checking a line, and had gone back to sleep. But there were no scheduled checks. I remembered the sound too, a low rumble, a pump maybe. They hadn't just dumped poison in my reservoir. They had brought in a crew in the middle of the night to do it quietly. They were trying to hide it. Why go to all that trouble? Why send a cleanup crew to a mess you were about to blame on someone else? The answer was right there, hanging in the dark, and I just couldn't see it. It was like a loose wire in an engine. Something wasn't connecting right. They didn't just want the fishing to stop. They wanted the reservoir itself. But why? I stood up and walked to the back office, the room where I kept the relics of my life's work. My fingers, stained with a lifetime of grease and dirt and ink, ran along the spines of old binders. Decades of consulting work, infrastructure projects, water systems I'd helped design all over the state. I pulled out a heavy, dusty folder, the label written in my own hand from nearly 40 years ago. It said simply, Reservoir, Original Plans. I carried it to the big drafting table I never had the heart to get rid of and untied the twine. I unrolled the large, brittle blueprint, the paper crackling in the quiet house. My eyes scanned the familiar lines I'd drawn myself, the topography of the land, the depth charts, the spillway design, and then I saw it. A faint blue line, almost faded with time, leading away from the reservoir's deepest point, branching off from the main overflow culvert. It wasn't a line I'd paid much attention to in years. It ran east, straight under the very land where the HOA clubhouse now stood, where their immaculate green lawns were irrigated, where their swimming pools sparkled in the sun. The line connected to a valve system, a shared water supply agreement I'd signed in 1984 with the original developer long before Anne Granger and her clipboard ever showed up. A cold, clear understanding washed over me. Anne Granger and her board hadn't just poisoned my granddaughter's sanctuary. In their arrogant, blind little power play, they had just poisoned their own lifeline. The next morning, the sun rose on a different man. The grief was still there, a hard knot in my chest, but now it had a purpose. Vengeance feels like a hot, messy thing in the movies. In real life, for an engineer, it feels like a blueprint. It's calm, it's precise, and you check your measurements twice. I spent the day not at the dead reservoir, but in the county archives. It's a dusty place that smells like old paper and forgotten stories. Nobody bothers you there. I pulled the utility records for the entire development, cross-referencing them with my own original plans. There it was, in black and white, the 1984 Shared Water Supply Agreement. Clear as day, it stated that the non-potable water for the community's clubhouse, 2 swimming pools, and extensive irrigation system was to be drawn from the Delaney Reservoir. My reservoir. Anne Granger, in her quest to control the view from her precious nature trail, had overlooked the one document that actually mattered. She had no idea she'd just declared war on her own water supply. Knowledge is power, but documented knowledge is a weapon. I made copies of everything. Next, I needed proof, hard scientific proof that would stand up against a lying bully with a clipboard. I called my old friend Walter Green. We'd spent 20 years working government contracts together. I'd design the systems, he'd test the water. He was retired now, mostly spending his time complaining about his garden gophers and drinking coffee that was strong enough to dissolve steel. "Frank," he grumbled into the phone, "don't tell me you've built another dam without a permit." I explained the situation, the reservoir, the HOA, the dead fish, the smell. There was a pause on the line. "Sulfur, you say? Sounds like a commercial-grade algicide. Nasty stuff. Illegal to use in a private watershed that feeds into a community system." A grim smile touched my lips. "That's what I was hoping you'd say, Walt. I need you to test some samples, off the books." He sighed, a theatrical sound. "Fine, but you owe me a steak dinner, a big one." That night, I became a ghost on my own land. I bought 3 small, motion-activated trail cams, the kind hunters use. I dressed in dark clothes and moved through the woods, circling the reservoir. I placed one camera disguised in a thicket of bushes overlooking the spot where the grass was scorched. I put another one high in an old oak, pointing toward the service road. The last one I placed near the main valve junction, hidden in a hollow log. If anyone came back, I'd see them. Then I collected my samples. I wore thick rubber gloves and used sterilized glass jars. 1 sample from the surface of the reservoir, 1 from the mud at the bottom, and 1, most importantly, from the sprinkler head on the 18th green of their pristine golf course, which was spitting out a weak, sputtering stream even in the dead of night. I packed the jars in a cooler with ice and drove them to Walter's house first thing in the morning. He answered the door in a coffee-stained robe, looking at the cooler like I'd brought him a dead animal. "Better be good, Frank," he muttered, leading me back to the impressive lab he'd built in his garage. He worked quietly, precisely, his old skills as sharp as ever. While he ran the tests, I watched. It was fascinating, the methodical process of uncovering a hidden truth. 2 hours later, he leaned back from his microscope and whistled softly. "Well, I'll be," he said, holding up a printout. "Your HOA's landscaper has expensive taste. This is a restricted-use chemical compound, the kind of stuff you have to be licensed to buy and handle. Highly effective for killing everything in a pond, and highly illegal to introduce into any water system that people might, swim in." He tapped the paper. "And the best part? It's traceable. Every batch has a unique chemical signature, like a fingerprint, to track it back to the distributor. Bingo. Now I just needed to find out who bought it. A quick search of the HOA's public meeting minutes gave me the name of their landscaping vendor, a company called Greenleaf Scapes. Their office was in a small industrial park on the other side of town. I didn't want to confront them there. I waited. The next afternoon, I followed their truck from the HOA neighborhood to a gas station. The driver, a man in his 40s with a weary face and a company logo on his shirt, went inside to pay for gas. I approached him as he came out. I kept my voice low and non-threatening. "You're with Greenleaf, right? You guys do the landscaping over at the Summit Creek HOA." He looked at me, suspicious. "Yeah, who's asking?" I showed him a picture of my dead fish on my phone. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "We had an incident a few nights ago," I said calmly. "Someone dumped a restricted chemical into my private reservoir. My friend, a water chemist, just identified it. Turns out it's the exact same compound your company special orders." Panic flashed across his face. He started to stammer, shaking his head. I don't know anything about that." I held up a hand. "Look, I'm not after you. I know you're just a guy trying to do his job, but I also know that stuff is tracked. If the county gets involved, they're going to follow that chemical signature right back to your boss, and then to you. All I need is the truth." He deflated, slumping against the side of his truck. He ran a hand over his face. "Look, man," he whispered, his eyes darting around the parking lot. "The board president, that Granger lady, she ordered it. She called it a pond decontamination, said it was attracting pests and was an eyesore." He looked me straight in the eye, his own full of a dawning horror. "She said you didn't even live there. She told me you were trespassing on HOA land." I felt the final piece of their stupid, arrogant plan click into place. It wasn't just about stopping me from fishing. They weren't just going to get away with poisoning my reservoir. They were going to sue me for it. They were going to pin the whole thing on me and use it as leverage to seize control of my land and my water, once and for all. They thought they had me cornered. They had no idea they'd just arm me. 2 days later, the official letter arrived. It came via certified mail, a tactic designed to intimidate. The envelope felt heavy in my hand, thick with self-importance. Inside, couched in needlessly complex legal language, was a cease and desist order. It accused me, Frank Delaney, of knowingly contaminating a shared community water asset and demanded I immediately halt all activity on my property pending an environmental assessment that I would be required to pay for. It was breathtaking in its audacity. Anne Granger wasn't just lying. She was building an entire false reality on paper and daring me to challenge it. The war, it turned out, wouldn't just be fought with chemistry and blueprints. It was now a battle of public perception. And she had fired the first shot. Soon, the whispers started. The community had one of those neighborhood Facebook groups, a place that was usually filled with posts about lost cats and complaints about garbage pickup. Now, my name was all over it. Anonymous posts cleverly worded with phrases like, "I heard from a reliable source," and "someone needs to look into the old man by the lake," painted me as a reckless polluter. Anne, of course, was in the comments, playing the part of the concerned leader. "The board is taking this environmental threat very seriously," she wrote, "and we are exploring all legal options to protect our community's health and property values." She made it sound like I was building a toxic waste dump in my backyard. The change was immediate and chilling. Neighbors who used to give a friendly wave from their cars now stared straight ahead as they drove past my property. The mailman, a guy I'd shared jokes with for a decade, suddenly couldn't meet my eye. I had become the villain in my own story, cast in a role written by a woman who wouldn't know an honest day's work if it hit her in the face. The worst of it came from my own family. Lisa called me, her voice tight with anxiety. "Dad, what is going on? People from the HOA are calling the hospital, asking my coworkers about you. They're making it sound like you're unstable." I could hear the fear in her voice, the desperate need for all of this to just go away. "Let it go, Dad," she pleaded. "Just pay their fine or whatever they want. It's not worth this." I tried to explain, to tell her about the water lines, the setup, but the technical details just made me sound more obsessed, more like the crazy old man they were making me out to be. A few days later, she brought Kay over for a visit. My granddaughter ran toward the path to the reservoir, shouting, "Gramps, can we go see the turtles?" Before Lisa could stop her, I knelt down and put a hand on her shoulder. "The water's a little sick right now, sweetheart," I said, the words tasting like ash. "We have to let it rest and get better." She looked from my face to the dark, still water, and her little expression crumpled. "Why can't we go to our rock?" she asked, her voice a small, wounded whisper. That question hit me harder than any legal threat or dirty look from a neighbor. I saw the legacy of this place, the healing it had offered, being tarnished in the eyes of the one person it was meant for. That night, for the first time, I almost gave in. The fight felt too big, the lies too suffocating. I took Kay's little pink tackle box from its shelf, carried it out to my workshop, and buried it under a pile of old tarps in the corner. It felt like burying a piece of my own heart. I sat at my drafting table, staring at the old blueprint, the source of this whole mess. I was exhausted. Anne had successfully isolated me. She'd turned my neighbors, and even a part of my own family, against me. It was a classic bully tactic. Make the target feel so alone, they give up. I traced the faint, blue line of the HOA's water pipe with my finger, a monument to their stupid short-sighted greed. As my finger moved along the page, it brushed against the dense block of text in the corner, the original easement agreement from 1984. I'd read the main parts 100 times, but I'd always skimmed the boilerplate legal clauses. This time, I didn't. I read every single word, and there, buried in paragraph 11, subsection C, was a sentence I had forgotten I ever helped write. In the event of a significant environmental disruption to the primary water source, whether natural or man-made, primary right of control for the shared water system, including flow regulation and diversion, shall revert to the private landowner until the source is certified as fully restored by a licensed systems consultant. It was a fail-safe, a little clause I'd insisted on 40 years ago to protect my property from any potential liability from the developer's actions. It was a buried legal trigger that no one on that HOA board, in their rush to print signs and write threatening letters, had ever bothered to read. Anne Granger thought she was the only one who could wield bureaucracy as a weapon. She was wrong. A new kind of energy flowed through me, pushing away the exhaustion. This was no longer just about defense. It was about taking control. The next day, I paid the fee to have my old professional license as a certified water systems consultant reinstated. Then, I went to a specialty plumbing supply warehouse and bought a high-pressure industrial filtration valve. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, all polished steel and precision gauges. For the rest of the day, I worked. Down in the damp earth of the valve junction box, hidden by the trees, I installed my new piece of equipment. It was hard work for a 72-year-old man, wrestling with heavy pipes and tight seals, but every turn of the wrench felt like I was taking back a piece of my life. This new valve allowed me to do one very simple thing: redirect the flow of water at will. I could let the poisoned water sit and stagnate in their pipes, or I could shut it off completely. For now, I just closed the main valve 90% of the way, reducing their supply to a pathetic trickle. I went back to my cabin, showered, and sat down with a cup of coffee. I didn't have to wait long. Just after 5 o'clock, as the first sprinklers on the golf course were scheduled to sputter to life, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a message popped up. It was from Anne Granger, her voice no longer calm and condescending, but a high-pitched, panicked squeak. "Mr. Delaney, this is Annette Granger. There appears to be a problem with the water pressure at the clubhouse. We need to talk, now." I didn't call her back. I let her panic simmer. Over the next 24 hours, the ripples of my little adjustment spread through the community. The HOA's main swimming pool was shut down, a sign citing mechanical issues with the filtration system. Brown, sludgy water coughed out of the sprinklers meant to keep the common areas green, leaving ugly stains on the perfect lawns. I heard from a neighbor who had finally decided to talk to me that the clubhouse bathrooms were unusable. Anne Granger called 3 more times, her messages growing more frantic. She had no idea what the problem was, and she was terrified. She scheduled an emergency community meeting and posted flyers on every lamppost, the headline screaming, "Urgent Community Water Supply." This time, I knew I was invited. I arrived a few minutes late, by design. The clubhouse was packed, a standing room-only crowd of anxious and angry homeowners. Rumors were flying: a busted water main, a county-wide shortage, a contamination from a nearby farm. Anne stood at the podium, looking frazzled. Her usual crisp blouse was slightly rumpled, and she kept dabbing her forehead with a tissue. She had a city water official on speakerphone, and he was patiently explaining that their municipal water lines were fine. The problem, he said, was isolated to their secondary irrigation and recreational systems. I walked in carrying a single heavy binder and a small projector. I didn't make a sound, just set my equipment up at a small table near the back. Anne's eyes locked on me, and a flicker of something, fear, suspicion, hatred, crossed her face. "As I was saying," she announced into the microphone, trying to regain control, "the board is actively investigating the source of this disruption. Unfortunately, we believe it may be related to the recent environmental vandalism committed by Mr. Frank Delaney." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "He has already proven he is willing to damage our community resources, and we have reason to believe this is his latest act of retaliation." The room erupted in murmurs. People turned to stare at me, their expressions a mix of anger and confusion. I let her finish, let her dig her own grave a little deeper. When she was done, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I didn't raise my voice. "Ma'am," I said, my voice calm and steady, cutting through the noise, "you are mistaken." Before she could respond, I turned on my projector. The room darkened slightly, and a bright, clear image appeared on the wall behind her. A high-resolution scan of my original blueprint, the 1984 water system plan. The faint blue line showing the pipe from my reservoir to their clubhouse was now highlighted in bright red. "For those of you who don't know me," I began, addressing the crowd, "my name is Frank Delaney. I'm a retired civil engineer, and 40 years ago, I helped design the water systems for this entire area. What you're looking at is the blueprint for your non-potable water supply." I walked them through it, step by step. I used simple words, no jargon. I explained how the water from my reservoir, the one they all called the old man's pond, filled their pools and watered their lawns. I could see the dawning realization on people's faces. This wasn't some abstract utility. It was a direct connection they had never known existed. Anne tried to interrupt, stammering something about outdated documents, but I just kept talking, my voice overriding hers. Then I switched the projector to a new file. The screen filled with a grainy, time-stamped video from one of my trail cams. It showed the Greenleafscapes truck backing down the service road in the middle of the night. It showed the landscaper, his face clearly visible, hauling heavy canisters to the edge of my reservoir and pouring their contents into the water. "This," I said, letting the video play in silence for a moment, "is how your water supply was poisoned, at the direct order of your HOA president." A collective gasp went through the room. It was one thing to hear rumors. It was another to see the crime on video. The nervous treasurer, Cheryl Tang, looked like she was about to faint. Anne was beet red, sputtering into the microphone. "This is fabricated, doctored video. He's a liar." I switched the image again. This time, it was Walter's official lab report. "This is the chemical analysis of the water taken from your own clubhouse sprinklers. It shows a restricted use algicide, illegal for this application, in concentrations high enough to cause skin irritation and kill aquatic life. The report is certified. The science doesn't lie." Then came the final move. I projected the image of the easement agreement with paragraph 11, subsection C, highlighted and magnified. "According to the legal agreement your HOA has been violating for months," I announced, my voice resonating with 40 years of quiet authority. "The poisoning of my reservoir constitutes a significant environmental disruption. And this clause, which you clearly never read, states that in such an event, full and primary control of the entire water system reverts to me." The room was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the cheap carpet. I looked directly at Anne Granger, whose face had gone from red to a pasty white. "Your board didn't just poison my fish," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "They poisoned their own water. They lied to you about it. They tried to frame me for it. And they got caught." The silence broke. A man in the front row, a father who I'd often seen at the pool with his kids, shot to his feet. "My kids swam in that water," he yelled, pointing at Anne. "You let my kids swim in poison water." Suddenly, the whole room erupted. People were shouting, demanding answers. Cheryl Tang, the treasurer, burst into tears and pushed her way toward the exit, shouting, "I told her it was a bad idea. I'm resigning." Anne Granger was trapped, a sea of angry faces surrounding the podium. I picked up my binder and walked back to the front. I turned off my projector, and in the sudden quiet, I looked at the shocked faces of my neighbors. "As the current legal controller of this water system," I said calmly and clearly, "I am officially shutting it off. As of tomorrow morning, water flow will be cut completely until further notice. And you," I said, looking right at the dissolving puddle that was once Anne Granger, "will all be getting a bill for the full cost of restoring my reservoir to its original condition. If, of course, I even decide to let you keep using it at all." Walking out of that clubhouse was like walking out of a pressure cooker. The chaos I left behind was a symphony of her own making. I didn't feel triumph, not yet. I just felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The next morning, I was true to my word. I walked down to the valve junction, inserted the heavy steel key, and gave it a full turn. With a deep thud that I felt in the soles of my feet, the flow of water to the Summit Creek HOA ceased entirely. The silence that followed was absolute. For Anne Granger, losing face was worse than losing power. Losing both at the same time sent her into a spiral. Her manufactured authority had crumbled, and she had nothing left but petty rage. The threatening letters started the next day. They were no longer on official HOA letterhead, but typed on plain paper and stuffed into my mailbox, filled with misspelled legal threats and desperate accusations. She accused me of everything from blackmail to domestic terrorism. I just filed them neatly in my binder, right next to the lab reports. She called the county water board, screaming that I had illegally seized community assets. I got a call from Peterson, the administrator. I could almost hear him smiling through the phone. "Got a rather emotional call from a Ms. Granger," he said. I explained to her that based on the easement agreement you provided, your actions are, unfortunately for her, perfectly legal. He paused. And I also mentioned that we've opened an investigation into the illegal use of a restricted chemical based on an anonymous tip. Funny that. Her desperation escalated. 2 nights later, my new trail cam sent an alert to my phone. I pulled up the feed and watched in disbelief. It was Anne. Dressed in dark clothes, she was fumbling with a pair of bolt cutters at the lock on the service gate that led to the valve junction. She was clumsy, panicked, and utterly out of her element. It was pathetic. She was trying to break onto my land to turn the water back on herself, as if a simple valve was the source of her problems. She couldn't get the lock open. She threw the bolt cutters to the ground in frustration and started yanking on the gate, rattling it furiously. That's when my granddaughter's dog, a little terrier mix Lisa had gotten her named Pip, started barking from the back porch. The dog has a surprisingly ferocious bark for a 10-pound animal. The noise must have spooked Anne. She froze, looked wildly around into the darkness, and then scrambled back to her car and sped off. I saved the video file. It was Exhibit D. Her last move was her dumbest. The very next evening, just after dusk, she came back. This time, she didn't bother with the service gate. She parked on the main road and tried to climb the fence along the front of my property. It's not a tall fence, just an old split rail, but it's sturdy. She was halfway over, one leg snagged on the top rail, when Pip went ballistic again. This time, I was ready. I turned on the powerful floodlights I'd installed over my workshop and stepped out onto the porch. Pinned in the beam of light like a startled raccoon, Anne froze, blinking in the glare. She was caught. "Evening, Anne," I said, my voice carrying easily in the quiet air. "Looks like you're trespassing. Again." I held up my phone, the screen clearly visible. "I'm calling the sheriff." She tried to bluster her way out of it, claiming she was just inspecting the fence line for the HOA, but her voice was shaking. By the time the deputy's car pulled up my long driveway, she was practically weeping. The deputy was young, professional, and listened patiently as I explained the situation, showed him the video from the night before, and pointed to Anne still tangled up in my fence. He looked at Anne, then at me, then back at Anne. He sighed. "Ma'am, you need to come with me." Watching her being led to the patrol car, a woman whose entire identity was built on enforcing bogus rules, now arrested for breaking real laws on my property, was a strange moment. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about order being restored. The news of her arrest spread through the community like wildfire. The HOA board convened an emergency session without her. The tide had not just turned, it was a tsunami. Faced with lawsuits from angry parents, an investigation by the county, and a complete shutdown of their water, the board folded completely. In a public vote, they unanimously moved to remove Annette Granger as president and revoke her board membership, effective immediately. The residents, now armed with the truth, demanded full transparency. The local news station, tipped off by an anonymous source with a very well-organized binder of evidence, picked up the story. The headline read, "Veterans Pond Poisoned by HOA Backfires Badly." A few days later, the remaining board members, humbled and terrified, requested a meeting. It wasn't in their clubhouse. It was at my kitchen table. They agreed to all of my terms. The HOA would pay for the complete restoration of my reservoir, including restocking the fish, under my direct supervision as the paid consultant of record. They would issue a formal public apology to me and my family, and they would rewrite the HOA bylaws to include a new clause based on my easement's forgotten text that severely limited the board's authority over private property. Anne Granger's reign of terror was officially over. A few weeks after that, the cleanup began. A professional environmental crew, paid for by the HOA's emergency fund, was working at the reservoir's edge, draining, dredging, and preparing to restore the water. I was out there watching them work when a car pulled up. It was Anne. She was just there to collect some personal items from the clubhouse. She walked past me, head down, refusing to make eye contact. She looked smaller, diminished, the crisp blouse replaced by a crumpled sweatshirt. All the fake power had been stripped away, leaving nothing behind. I didn't say a word to her. I just turned back to the water. I walked over to the spot where I kept my gear, reached down, and placed Kay's small pink tackle box right back by the water's edge, ready for a new beginning. It took 2 months of hard work, careful supervision, and the steady, reassuring hum of professional equipment, the dead water was pumped out and treated. The contaminated sediment was dredged and replaced with clean riverbed soil, and then slowly the reservoir was allowed to refill with fresh, clear spring water. I watched every step, my consultant's license giving me the authority to sign off on every invoice and every phase of the restoration. The new HOA board, a collection of humbled and much quieter individuals, didn't question a single decision. They paid the bills, they stayed out of my way, and they learned a very expensive lesson about reading the fine print. When the water was finally deep and clean again, a truck arrived carrying a precious cargo, hundreds of young, healthy trout. Watching them slip from the chute into their new home, their silver bodies flashing in the sunlight, felt like a resurrection. The silence of the past few months was finally broken by the sound of life. The birds came back first, then the dragonflies, and soon the familiar, peaceful hum of a healthy ecosystem returned to the air. The chemical smell was gone, replaced by the clean scent of water, pine, and damp earth. I waited another week, letting the fish settle in, letting the place heal completely. Then, one Saturday morning, I called Lisa. "Tell Kay to bring her tackle box," I said. "The turtles missed her." When they arrived, Kay ran from the car, her little pink box clutched in her hand. She stopped at the edge of the path and just stared. Her eyes were wide, taking in the clear water, the darting fish, the sunlight sparkling on the surface. She looked up at me, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. "It's better now, Gramps," she said softly. We walked to her rock, the big flat one that had looked like a tombstone, and now, once again, looked like a throne. I helped her bait her hook, her small hands guiding the line. She cast it out, the little red and white bobber landing with a satisfying plop. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We just sat there, side by side, watching the bobber dance on the gentle ripples. An hour passed, then another. It didn't matter if she caught anything. The act itself was the victory. This place, our place, had been violated, but it hadn't been destroyed. Its spirit was stronger than their poison. A few days later, I got a call from Peterson down at the county water board. He sounded more cheerful than I'd ever heard him. "Frank," he said, "I thought you'd like to know that your little HOA dispute has made some pretty big waves." He told me that the county legal team, prompted by the media attention and the sheer recklessness of the HOA's actions, had reviewed all the regional water use easements. They had found dozens of similar outdated agreements, full of vague language ripe for abuse by power-hungry boards. "That clause of yours," Peterson said, a note of admiration in his voice, "the one about control reverting to the landowner, they loved it. The county commissioners just passed a new regulatory policy. Any new or revised shared water agreement in the state now has to include similar language. They're calling it the Delaney Clause in the internal memos." I stood there on my porch looking out at the water, and I had to laugh. A 40-year-old failsafe, written to protect one man's pond, had become the new standard, protecting hundreds of homeowners from the kind of overreach that had almost cost me everything. They tried to kill what they didn't understand, but you can't poison something built with care and expect to walk away clean. The final piece of the healing came from the community itself. One evening, a pickup truck I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. 2 men got out. One was the father who had yelled at Ann during the meeting. He approached me cautiously, hat in hand. "Mr. Delaney," he said, the community, we wanted to give you something." They went to the back of the truck and carefully lifted out a beautiful, thick slab of carved cedar. Etched deeply into the wood were the words, "Kay's Rock, a place of peace." Below the words, a small, simple carving of a turtle. "We all pitched in," the other man said, avoiding my eyes. "We're sorry for not listening sooner." I looked at the sign, then at the 2 men, and I saw not guilt, but genuine respect. The community had been manipulated by a bully, but they had found their way back. "Thank you," I said, my voice a little rough. "It's a fine piece of work." We mounted the sign on a post right next to the path leading to the rock, where it could be seen by anyone who walked by. It wasn't just a sign. It was an anchor, a permanent marker of a battle fought and won. It was a promise. A week later, I was sitting by the water, just enjoying the quiet, when the same neighbor approached again, this time with his young son in tow. The boy was holding a brand new fishing rod. "Afternoon, Frank," the man said. "I know this is your private spot, but I was wondering, would you teach my boy how to cast?" I looked at the boy, who was staring at the water with a look of pure wonder, the same look Kay had all those years ago. The cycle was starting anew. I smiled, a real easy smile. I gestured to the spot next to me. "Pull up a piece of ground," I said. "Start with patience. The fish don't like bullies either."